Thank you, Chair. We're just seeing some news that Randy Boissonneau's company, GHI, has been suspended from eligibility for government contracts. Could you clarify if that's correct and whether or not GHI, Randy Boissonneau's company, is currently eligible for contracts?
Thank you for the question. So I can confirm that as the Registrar of Ineligibility and Suspension, I provisionally suspended GHI from doing business with the Government of Canada. The suspension came into effect November 22nd, 2024, and will be in place for 90 days, but can be extended if necessary.
Okay, thank you. Could you clarify just the specific reasons why you took that step?
So before answering that, it's important to mention that we're constantly looking at various type of information while assessing the risk that a supplier may pose to the federal government. So we have gone through multiple sources of information, including lawsuits, both civil and criminal, and the information that has been brought to our attention recently concerning an Edmonton Police Service investigation kind of put us at the right level of threshold to take action under the policy.
Thank you. So we obviously don't think, in the Conservative Party, we don't think that GHI should be getting government contracts. But it sounds from your answer like Indigenous identity fraud was not a contributing factor to your decision to suspend them. Could you clarify whether a clear case of Indigenous identity fraud, false claims about being an Indigenous-owned company, was a contributing factor to your decision to suspend them?
I can confirm that the GHI has never been a member or never been on the Indigenous Business Directory. They have not received or participated in set-asides for Indigenous processes, so it was not a factor from a contracting perspective.
Well, okay, they made false claims in the process of making bids. That's what's been reported on. So you're saying they weren't on the Indigenous business list, but they nonetheless claimed to be an Indigenous business because they thought it would provide some advantage for them in the context of making those bids. That's still identity fraud, whether they were successful or not in getting that particular contract, and whether or not they were on that list. They still clearly misrepresented themselves. So, do you think that GHI committed Indigenous identity fraud, regardless of the outcome? Do you think they committed that fraud, and was that a factor in the decision to suspend?
Thank you for the question. So it's important to mention that as the Registrar of Ineligibility and Suspension, I am not a law enforcement agency, and I do not have to confirm whatever behavior is criminal or not. But to answer your question, the representation has been part of the cases that we have looked at and will form one of the factors that will be looked at by the determination team while finalizing the assessment of GHI.
Okay, it sounds like you're saying yes. It sounds like you're saying yes, that the fact that part of your calculation in terms of the provisional suspension and the ongoing review you're undertaking, one of the factors was reports about misrepresentation of Indigenous identity, which you're clarifying. It's not you're not necessarily saying it was criminal, but that you're saying was misrepresentation. It sounds like you're saying yes. Are you saying yes?
I'm saying that it's part of the assessment, but the important point that you made at the end, that I'm not commenting on the criminal aspect of it, or it's a very important point to take into consideration.
Yeah. Okay. I understand. So GHI, a company that is owned by a current Liberal MP, former cabinet minister, has now been suspended from eligibility for government contracts provisionally. Of course, we would advocate a stronger position of them not being eligible for government contracts, period. And I note that that initial suspension did follow us calling for that. And I think there's work that continues to be done to get to the bottom of what happened with Randy Boissonneau and this company, and we'll certainly continue to follow that work and do that work. For our information, I would like to request that you provide this committee with all of the bids that have been made by GHI, so we can see what claims were made in those bids. Is that something you're able to provide us with?
Thank you so much. I can partially answer your question, and that it will follow by document. So the integrity verification services are aware of two bids, one that came in 2020 and the other one that came in 2023. We are in the process of gathering paper copy of those bids, and while we have gathered them, it will be our pleasure to transmit that information to the committee.
Okay. Thank you. So we'll look forward to that information as soon as it's available. On Indigenous identity fraud in general, you said in the opening that some action has been taken against bad actors. Could you name the bad actors and identify the action that's been taken against bad actors in relation specifically to Indigenous identity fraud? And if we run out of time, I'd like that list in writing.
Mr. Chair, I apologize if I made misconstrued or conflated taking action with bad actors under the OSIC as opposed to implying that we're taking action specifically against an Indigenous business. We have not taken action to my knowledge.
Well, sorry, we're not really talking about Indigenous business. We're talking about those who pretend to be Indigenous businesses. So maybe could you clarify, has any action ever been taken against a business in response to Indigenous identity fraud as part of the procurement process?
Thank you for the question.
Short answer, please.
Gordon? OSIC has no role or responsibility in determining which supplier belongs to IBD or not, or whether that supplier made a false representation. In order to take some action, we absolutely need to have a referral from a lead operation agency. In that case, will be ISC.
Right, but I'm just wondering, has any action been taken against any company? Because if they provide you with the referral, say there's a problem, then you follow up on that, is my understanding. So are there any cases in which you've been able to identify Indigenous identity fraud happened here and there's been a consequence?
Sorry, we have not been referred any cases from Indigenous Services Canada of misrepresentation that we can, but that said, as I said in my opening statement, we have reached out to Indigenous Services Canada and asked them that if they are aware of anything, to please refer them, and we would be happy to look at them.
Yeah, that's concerning and good to know. So thank you for the information.
Thanks very much.
Just a comment off the top. It's pretty incredible to me that Liberals are still trying to defend Randy Boissonneau, and we saw that with Mr. Sousa's comments. Just to be clear about the facts, GHI was owned by Randy Boissonneau. It appears that he dumped his shares, yes, at the last minute. He dumped them in June of this year. But he owned and directed this company while sitting in the federal cabinet and while pretending to be Indigenous. So Mr. Sousa pointing out that the Liberal ex-minister dumped his shares at the last minute, I don't think is much of a defense. This company was owned by the ex-minister who falsely claimed to be Indigenous-owned, and false claims about his Indigenous identity were made by the Liberal Party itself. This is why it's an important issue, and all of the events around the bids on these contracts happened while he owned the company and while he was still sitting around the federal cabinet table. Follow-up question to the officials on the issue of Indigenous identity fraud. So AFN has said that a majority of the beneficiary of these programs are shell companies. This is testimony that's been backed up by others. Many concerns, as you've heard, raised by Indigenous leaders about rampant abuse, in particular Indigenous identity fraud and various structures that seek to present non-Indigenous companies as Indigenous through abusive joint ventures and other things. Meanwhile, you're telling us that the government department, Indigenous Services, that's responsible for overseeing this framework has failed to refer even one single case of Indigenous identity fraud to you. There seems to be a massive disconnect then between what Indigenous leaders are saying on the one hand about rampant abuse and the failure of the government department responsible for this to refer a single case of Indigenous identity fraud. How do you explain this discrepancy?
I've been in contact with my colleagues and counterparts at Indigenous Service Canada. They have followed up with the AFN. They've invited the AFN to provide specific names. We have not, to my knowledge, received the specific names. But if the AFN were to furnish the names of the companies that they're concerned with, we will absolutely look at them and do an assessment.
Okay, but I'll just say on that, you've got significant concerns from many different Indigenous leaders. It's not their job to police the specific enforcement of the program. They're seeing a problem in general, and you would expect that government departments would be able to assess these bids, identify the problems, and when you don't have a single case identified by the government, it suggests that there's just a lack of interest, a lack of capacity, whatever it is, to actually enforce the basic parameters of this program. I guess I'd say, like, isn't it your job to, well, maybe not yours as particular individuals, but isn't it the government's responsibility to enforce this program and not Indigenous leaders who are outside of government?
Again, my understanding is that Indigenous Services Canada periodically is doing verification of the businesses on the Indigenous Business Directory, and that some businesses will be removed over time because they'll have changes in business status or whatnot. In their work and verification, they have yet to refer one to us on the pure basis of misrepresentation.
Yeah, I guess it just seems to me, though, like, you know, maybe you guys should offer a contract to some of the folks at the Globe and Mail, because they are turning up all kinds of information about abuses in this program. Others, Global News, many have exposed critical information around abuses of this program. The government can't identify a single instance of Indigenous identity fraud, it seems, and yet media and Indigenous leaders are bringing all of these cases forward. I just don't understand where the disconnect is.
Well, there is one area which is very technical, is, to my understanding, some of the businesses that Global News and First Nation University and others have identified as saying that they don't have indigeneity, or their respect to businesses that are part of a Indigenous organization that may not be recognized by those bodies, but is recognized by the Government of Canada.
Okay, yeah. So yes, you have an instance where you have communities that are not considered Indigenous communities by mainstream Indigenous organizations that the Government of Canada does. So that's another issue. But like, how do you explain the fact that there's not a single case? Has the position of the government, like, are you listening to? Is the government listening to what Indigenous leaders are saying?
Brief answer.
Again, Indigenous Services Canada is doing verifications, and perhaps the explanation is that the veracity of this misrepresentation isn't there.
I'll be splitting my time with my colleague, Ms. Kusi. So thank you as well to the witnesses for joining us. You are a fairly new office, given your creation in May of this year. And I would just simply note that it was, in fact, the Deputy Minister for PSPC, Ariane Reza, who stated on June 3rd that the committee, that the creation of OSIC will help the department respond more effectively to cases of supplier misconduct and unethical behavior. I guess what I'm hearing today is that the work that you will be doing is very reliant on whether or not departments refer these cases to your office. Is that correct?
Thank you so much. It's important to mention that we can do two things. So we can self-assess some cases based on other source of information, and it's what we did in the case of GHI, because it came through other means than an authoritative or an authority within a department. And for internal misconduct within the government or within the operation of the department, of course, we will rely on their knowledge of their program to refer the case. But this doesn't preclude us from self-assessing based on other source of information.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. Mills, in your opening statement, you stated that because PSPC gives out such large contracts, the department can really only look to get Indigenous businesses involved as subcontractors. However, we have learned over the last couple of years, as we've been studying everything that's been going on in procurement, that departments don't track subcontractors. How is it that how is it that you can say that PSPC is focused on getting Indigenous businesses involved as subcontractors when you aren't even tracking subcontractors?
What I can say is that for the very large transactions, many of those will require Treasury Board authorities, and so I will see the Treasury Board submissions, or the procurement results will sometimes require Deputy Minister approval. So I will see that the contracts that are being awarded do have Indigenous participation plans. They have target levels. So I know that the activity are being identified at those contracts. We haven't been systematically capturing that value. So that's what we're focused on as a department this year, is to make sure that we're systematically capturing where we have those Indigenous participation plans, or what the level of involvement is. I do agree it's been a big gap up until now, but I have seen these contracts going through. And I just want to clarify that there are some cases where Indigenous companies are the prime. So I know in the Arctic warning system, there's actually an Inuit company that is the prime. So it's just generally, in most cases, our large projects like the center block rehabilitation, there's no construction company in the Indigenous space that could carry that out.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, as I'm sure you're well aware, there are many issues which our Canadians are seized with at this time. Obviously, the privilege motion in the House of Commons, where the government is refusing to hand over the documents regarding the Green Slush Fund. As a result of the good work of this committee, we saw the resolution of the Minister of Employment, where he finally recognized what he was doing was wrong, because his Prime Minister would not take responsibility for removing him. And he finally resigned. And I really believe a lot of that has to do with the good work of this committee. But the other issue, Mr. Chair, that this committee, as well as Canadians are seized with, is the issue of the $9 million residence in New York. We have had Mr. Clark here twice now to testify. We have found that he has not been truthful with this committee. Comments that he has referred to as comments in passing definitely appear to be more than that. We have had colleagues on this committee say comments in passing include things like, the weather today is gloomy. We are getting close to the holidays, but the comments that Mr. Clark made are significantly more in depth, show much more of his involvement in choosing this $9 million residence. And I believe that there is a yearning from both Canadians and this committee to know more from those who were there, Mr. Chair. And with that, I'm moving the following motion: that the committee call Mario Bott, the Director of Management at the Consulate General of Canada in New York, as well as the three other individuals in the room when Mr. Clark made comments in passing about the residents, as he stated in testimony November 21st, and that one additional meeting be held on this study to accommodate these witnesses. Again, Mr. Chair, he says they are comments in passing. It is evident that we need more information.
I'm going to interrupt you for 2 seconds.
Certainly. Thank you,
It has gone out already a few days ago, but the clerk is just sending it out again.
Thank you very much. It's evident that we need to get to the bottom of these comments in passing. Were they comments in passing, such as, once again, we will soon be in the month of December. Very simple comments in passing, or is there something more significant which indicates, as we have suspected, as we have determined, that Mr. Clark had a more significant role in convincing his good friend, the Prime Minister, to purchase him this $9 million residence? Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.